I've been talking recently about underrated producers and underrated appellations, but I wanted to go on a tangent today and talk about a vintage which is in some respects underrated. It's a 2013 vintage, and I opened 2 bottles from my cellar yesterday. In many ways, it's really a throwback vintage because it was the last time that we've had an early October harvest in Burgundy. The last time we really had a vintage defined by heavy rain. There was so much rainfall, in fact, you could see ducks swimming in the Beaune Premier Cru in places. And also, in fact, the last vintage where it was more disease pressure than the danger of overripeness that forced vignerons to pick their harvest date. And all of that, I think, came together to mean that the growers were not particularly optimistic about it. It was just such a punishing season requiring constant treatments in the vines to control disease that at the end of the season, few people were able to be terribly optimistic about how the wines were going to turn out. It was also a vintage, with really high malic acids compared to those that have followed, and I think a vintage that in barrel transformed particularly because of the malolactic fermentation. Vintages like 15 or 17 or 18 with quite low levels of malic acid, the malolactic fermentation hasn't hugely changed the character of the wines, and élevage hasn't been quite as obviously transformative in terms of the balance of the wines as it was with 13. So I think that conspired to win the vintage a relatively unfavorable reception. And yet today the wines can be very interesting, and I think maybe we prize them, or I prize them all the more because of their trenchant acids. I mean, the throwback characteristic that I mentioned, the fact that it takes us back to an older style of more acid-driven red Burgundy, which we're not really seeing replicated in more recent vintages, and we'll see how 2020 turns out, of course, but it doesn't seem to have the makings of a late season so far. Now, the whites are more complicated than the reds, and I think that was because at the very end of September there was a bit of rain and a couple of warm days, and botrytis kind of got going in the grapes, and some of the 2013 whites ended up a bit sort of soft, aromatically exotic, and they're drinking in many cases very well now, and I think if you don't like those characteristics, now's a good time to drink many of them. But Burgundy, as ever, is defined by exceptions to the rule, and one such is Olivier Lamy, who, it's what's new, but he made some of the wines of the vintage, and I opened yesterday this Saint-Aubin Derrière chez Edouard from him. Incredibly incisive, coiled, tight-knit, fresh, vibrant, and with none of those exotic characteristics that define the white Burgundies of the vintage in many cases. Still very coiled, in fact, and really mineral bracing wine. So that's showing beautifully, and I thoroughly recommend all of Lamy's 13s. I've tried a bunch of them lately, and especially the Rémy has some terrific mid-palate amplitude, a bit more volume than the Derrière chez Edouard, so that's showing particularly well. And then on the red side of the ledger, I opened an Etellois Gevrey Village from Durochet. So I think reds, to wind up a little bit, maybe turned out better than whites, especially in the Côte de Nuit, where there were no issues with hail, which really ravaged parts of the Côte de Beaune. And they have this wonderful spine of acidity, and you can tell that the tannins, when they melt away, are going to leave behind wines that are incredibly transparent and fragrant. And to get that effect required serious sorting, serious work in the vineyards, and it's not every domain that achieved it by any means. But this cuvée is particularly good. It's sort of the insider's choice at Durochet. It's a little triangle between Chambertin and Griot-Chambertin, and he only takes the top part of the parcel for this bottling. The rest of it's blended into the regular Gevrey. And again, I mean, as I said at the beginning, what really excites me is this sort of throwback characteristic. It transports you back to the sort of more acid-driven vintages of the 90s, 80s, 70s, whatever. It's even better on day 2 than when I opened it yesterday afternoon. I'm amazed it survived that long in the house, in fact. But it's quite typical of really what the good producers were able to achieve in 13 and in the Côte de Nuit. And I think now's the time to start looking at the wines a bit more seriously. Some of them are still in the market, and in many cases they're evolving in a more interesting way than the 14s, which were a little bit more seductive out of barrel, but now have shut down and sort of show the shorter hang time and slightly firmer structural elements.